Hi, and welcome to CMO Journeys. I'm Christian Panak, and on this show, I talk about with the marketing leaders behind some of today's most interesting brands. We get into their career paths, how they think about marketing, and how they work with agencies. Today's guest is Linda Bethea, who recently served as Chief Marketing Officer at Danone North America, and she built her career across some of the most complex marketing organizations in the world, including PepsiCo and Diageo. Her perspective comes from operating at the intersection of brand, business, and enterprise decision-making. Linda, welcome to CMO Journeys.
Thanks for having me.
So Linda, this is CMO Journeys, so we like to start at the beginning of your journey. And I'd be very curious to know, if someone met you when you were 18, would they have predicted that you would end up becoming a CMO?
Absolutely not. I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. When I was younger than that, I actually thought I wanted to be a teacher. I always loved reading and writing, and so thought maybe I would be an English major. Ultimately, got really interested in psychology. I decided to be a psychology major, and then my career trajectory actually changed my senior year of college. I had an opportunity to take a class called The History of Advertising. And I fell in love with advertising and marketing and the psychology behind it, understanding why consumers behave the way they do and digging into the psychology behind that. And so from there, I knew I wanted to be a marketer.
Very good. Well, we're definitely going to want to talk more about that journey, but just kind of stick with the theme of your early life. What might be something that people might not expect about you and what you were like when you were younger?
I was very, very shy. I am a classic introvert, which surprises anyone that meets me at this point in my life. But I was painfully shy, wouldn't look people in the eye, never spoke in class, had, a very small circle of friends. And now I have a job where I travel the world speaking, at conferences in front of hundreds of people. So that has been a surprise to me and everyone else.
Yeah, was there something in particular that brought you out of that shell, or how did that evolution happen?
I think naturally as a marketer, you have to learn how to be more extroverted and interact with people, right? Early in your career, you're spending a lot of time with consumers. You're doing shop alongs, you're visiting them in their homes and looking in their pantries and fridges. So you have to learn to be able to connect. And then as you move up in your career, you're sitting in boardrooms and you need to learn how to find your voice and have that voice be impactful in those situations. And then during COVID, I actually decided to overcome my fear of public speaking. It felt like a non-threatening environment being behind a screen like we are now versus up on stage. And so I started doing a lot of virtual conferences and podcasts. And now I am much more comfortable with public speaking and speak on stages all the time.
Yeah, that's great. I think I have somewhat of a similar journey when it comes to that. I actually joined Toastmasters myself, and that was a really great experience, getting some live experience. But then the pandemic happened and everything kind of shut down. We weren't doing it live, but we were doing things virtually, and the virtual was a good bridge for me to do things live and in person. So yeah, that's great. So you've built your career across PepsiCo, Diageo, Danone. When you think about that in that journey in chapters, what were some of the moments that really shaped how you lead today?
Yeah, I've had a couple pivotal moments throughout my career. So I started at Frito-Lay directly out of business school. And I remember going through the interview process and they asked, if you could choose your first assignment, what would it be? And I said, I want to work on one of the big brands like Lay's, your flagship brand. And so that was actually my first assignment, was the assistant brand manager on Lay's. But what I quickly realized, that probably wasn't the right first assignment. As a brand manager on Lay's, you're one of a huge team working on the flagship brand, and you're probably not getting as much rich experience as your colleagues working on smaller brands. And so that was a real lesson for me, is to, the big, sexy plum assignments aren't always the ones where you're going to learn the most. It's the ones where you can really roll up your sleeves and dig into everything and have an impact. From there, I did have the opportunity to work in a number of different rotations at Frito-Lay. And after about 5 or 6 years in marketing, I realized that if I truly wanted to be successful as a marketer and a leader, I needed to understand other parts of the business. And so I raised my hand and asked for rotation into field. So Frito-Lay runs a direct store delivery system with over 20,000 employees who are the feet on the street, the people that are out in the stores every day delivering and merchandising the products. And so I actually moved from Texas up to the New York area and served in a hybrid sales and marketing role in the North Business Unit, which was the most competitive business unit for Frito-Lay at the time. And so it challenged me in terms of the business challenges, but also as a leader. All of a sudden, I was managing a team of sales professionals, all of whom were older than me and had tons more experience than me. And so it was very humbling. And I had to really check myself and really lean on them to teach me everything they knew about field sales. And I think I learned more in that year than I had in my prior 6 years combined.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that's another really good experience.
Yeah. So it sounds like you felt a little bit maybe in over your head at times in some of these roles. How did you push through?
I think it's really important to build really strong relationships with your peers and your teammates. I have not accomplished anything in my career alone. It's all been through teams, and I've built some really strong relationships, people that I still keep in touch with from my PepsiCo days, my Diageo days, my Danone days. I think teamwork is key to success. That's something I learned in business school. I went to the Kellogg School of Management, which is very much a school that teaches you how to work as part of a cross-functional team. Teamwork is everything. And I think I carried that through my career.
Yeah. So when you stepped into these larger enterprise roles, what was like that one moment where you realized that this was just way more complex than what you had expected? And what did that feel like?
I mean, all of the companies I've worked for have been large multinational corporations with huge brand portfolios. And I think, early in my career, I was focused on one brand. But as you move up in your career and you start to manage a portfolio, the complexity becomes very obvious. So, for example, in my last role as CMO at Danone, I was managing a portfolio of 20 brands. And so you have to really be smart about portfolio strategy and understanding the role of each brand in the portfolio in order to manage the complexity. That needs to drive your resource allocation, your staffing. Everything you do needs to align to that portfolio strategy so that you can try to simplify things as much as possible.
Yeah. How much in a role like that are you doing marketing versus doing this kind of management almost? Tell me a little bit about that. It's because that definitely is a unique set of challenges, an opportunity in that role versus when you're managing a single brand.
Yeah, I mean, you're much more hands-on, obviously, when you're managing a single brand or working at a smaller company. As you move up in your career and join the C-suite, it's much more about, C-suite level management and discussion, setting the strategy for the company, managing company performance. But luckily, I had a really amazing high-performing team, and I viewed my role as a leader is to set clear strategic direction and then get out of the way and let them execute. If they ran into obstacles, I could help remove those obstacles, but you have to be able to trust your team to get things done. And I think that, as I reflect on my career, some of the biggest leadership lessons I learned or some of the hardest transition moments I went through as a leader is moving from a doer to a leader, right? You get promoted because you're good at what you do. You're great at marketing, you're great at execution. And so you get promoted into roles where you're no longer responsible directly for the marketing or the execution. You're responsible for building the team that's going to do that. And that's a major inflection point as a leader. And you really have to learn how to let go because your team may not do it the way you would do it. It doesn't mean it's not going to be successful. So setting clear strategy and clear objectives that they can measure themselves against is really important as a leader.
Sure. And was there a leader when you were the doer that really set a great example that you maybe it was a piece of advice they did or just the way they operated or something that helped influence you and how you became the leader that you are?
Yeah, I mean, at PepsiCo, I was fortunate to work for a number of incredible leaders. And if you look at where people who were trained at PepsiCo, what they've gone on to do in their careers, it's pretty incredible. I can look across and see, dozens of CMOs and CEOs that I worked with at PepsiCo. But I had an amazing leader in Dave Scalera, who was the GM of the North Business Unit when I did that rotation that year. And he really took me under his wing and helped me understand not just the field sales side of things, but how the entire business unit was organized. At the time, they were going through some massive contract renegotiations with unions in Pennsylvania. That was eye-opening for me, right? He really just took me again under his wing and helped me understand all the nitty-gritty pieces of running a true business, which was invaluable throughout my career.
Yeah, yeah. So across all these organizations that you've worked with, what's a pattern that you just kept seeing? Something that seems like it shows up regardless of category, regardless of company. What's something that comes to mind?
Oh, so many things. I think one would be complacency. I think a lot of times if a brand has been successful, it's easy to get stuck in a if it's not broke, don't fix it pattern. But what I love about marketing, what I love about consumer goods is it's always changing. I think especially right now, we're living in a time of massive consumer change. And so you have to constantly be keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening with consumers and reevaluate your brand strategy. You can't get complacent because consumers will move on and competitors will meet them where you are and you'll be left behind. I think the other thing I've seen, particularly in large companies, is an inability to move quickly and make decisions. You're never going to have 100% of the data. You have to be willing as a leader to make a bold decision and commit to that and move forward.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue because we originally connected actually on LinkedIn through comments that on a post that we had done from our company, and you had said that you felt CMOs need a real seat at the table, not just a voice in marketing. And I'd like you to maybe think back across your roles when you felt like you actually had that seat and maybe you had not. If you can share a little bit around that.
Yeah, I think particularly for a consumer goods company, you have to have someone that's responsible for the voice of the consumer. That has to be the true north. And I've worked in organizations where maybe they were more finance led or more sales led or more operationally led. And all of those functions are important and they need to work together. But at the end of the day, growth is going to be driven with consumers, both short and long-term growth. And so that's why I think it's super important for a CMO to have a seat at the table and be held accountable. Be the one that is not just looking at short-term growth, but looking at that long-term growth. How are you building brands that are going to sustain for the long term and build value that can then translate into pricing power, into long-term sustainable growth? And I've had times throughout my career where that voice and the voice of the consumer was very much valued, and other times where it wasn't because we were chasing a short-term number. And so the easy thing to do was cut marketing investment. We'll cut marketing, we'll boost our profits, drop the marketing investment to the bottom line, we'll hit the number, and we'll move on to the next quarter. And that's great in the short term. You hit the numbers in the quarter, but that harms your brand in the long term. And climbing out of that hole requires even more investment going forward to regain the lost awareness, the lost salience, equity, et cetera.
Yeah. What would you say is different in how the decisions were getting made in those environments where marketing maybe wasn't getting cut versus those areas where they were? How were decisions making differently made?
I think decisions were made through a different lens. I think in organizations that are more short-term financially focused, it's all about the numbers and what the next quarter or the next year will bring. Whereas in organizations where marketing is more valued, it's more focused on strategy. What is our 3 to 5 year strategy? PepsiCo is a great example of that. We spend a lot of time on strategic planning. You set your 3 to 5 year strategy, then you built your 1 year annual plan, and you were constantly measuring and reevaluating throughout the year. But your strategy should be a sustainable long-term strategy. You should not be reinventing your strategy every single year. If you have to do that, it's not a good strategy.
Yeah, yeah. So at Danone, you were operating really at the intersection of brand, finance, and as we talked about earlier, portfolio strategy. What did maybe you underestimate about when you went into that particular role?
I think probably the complexity of the portfolio. Danone has a number of large global brands as well as brands and categories that only operate in the US. So that's a unique nuance when you're, managing huge brands and categories that don't translate to the rest of the globe. And so thinking about the prioritization of those versus global brands. And then the size discrepancy. We had billion-dollar brands in the portfolio. We scaled Oikos to $1 billion. International Delight was $1 billion. And then we had much smaller brands. We launched Stoke to disrupt the ready-to-drink coffee category, grew that to 400 million. We acquired Follow Your Heart, a very small plant-based brand. And so being able to have the agility to navigate the different growth models and brand strategies required for such different types of brands is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, yeah. And you partnered closely, from what I read, with the CFO to reshape, I believe it was like a $7 billion P&L.
Mhm.
Where did marketing and maybe finance align, and where did maybe things tend to get uncomfortable at times?
It's a great question. And I do think as a CMO, your finance partner needs to be, one of your closest C-suite relationships, because if your CFO doesn't believe in the power of brand building, you won't be successful. And so I think a couple different things. When I joined Danone, if you looked at the marketing investment, it was well below CPG averages in terms of marketing as a percent of net revenue. And if you looked within the investment itself, there were tons of opportunities for optimization. One, they were looking at about a 50-50 working, non-working split. So tons of inefficiency in the non-working spend. That was the easiest, quickest fix, right? Let's clean that up, shift more of our dollars to working dollars. So even if we don't get more investment, our working investment is working harder for us. Then I spent a lot of time with finance and the commercial organization looking at resource allocation. It's not one size fits all. It really depends on the role of the brand in the portfolio and where we need to lean into marketing investment versus where we may need to lean more into commercial levers and pull back on marketing investment. So really driving the focus and aligning on what are the big bets that will get a disproportionate amount of resources versus ones that maybe have less focus going forward. And so I think those were two critical pieces in reshaping the P&L, and then working very closely with the data and analytics team to prove out the value of marketing, showing not just the short-term ROI, but the long-term ROI as well, and what percent of our sales was attributable to the marketing investment. And that enabled us to continue to increase the investment itself.
Yeah. Have you seen cases where strong brand thinking actually hurt short-term business performance?
It depends on how you define that. Long-term investment requires investment. And in the short term, there may be folks in the C-suite and in the organization that think there's a better use of those dollars. And so that's what the conversations come down to. Is this the best place to spend limited dollars? And so you have to believe, without, easily available metrics in the short term, that it will pay out in the long term.
Yeah, yeah. Looking back at your last role, what maybe felt harder towards the end to move than maybe it did earlier in your career?
Ooh, what felt harder to move? I think just managing the increasingly complex external landscape, right? I mean, if I look at my career, I started in marketing before social media existed. That then became where you were spending all of your dollars as a marketer. And then we moved, to connected TV and streaming from linear TV. Then we moved to retail media networks, right? The media landscape has undergone such significant evolution. Then you add on e-commerce and omni-channel and direct to consumer. And so just the complexity of managing your media strategy and your media budgets, not to mention now the advent of AI and what that's doing to everything. And so that's a challenge to continue to stay on top of that as a marketer and ensure your team's focused on leveraging the right tools to drive the right outcomes.
Yeah. Did you find yourself saying no to certain things more often?
I'm very good at saying no. I think it's critical as a leader. You have to be able, again, to make bold decisions and say yes, but equally as important is saying no to things. And so I would say no to things that I thought were a distraction or things that weren't aligned to the brand strategy. That being said, I'm also a big believer in a test and learn environment, and we would carve out money to test things and do pilots because you may not know whether or not something will be successful, and it's okay to test and fail. I think you can learn just as much from your failures as you can from your successes, but absolutely you have to say no and keep focused on things that are aligned to your brand strategy.
Yeah. What about, I mean, maybe you answered this already with the media landscape, but I'm curious, like, was there certain things that were taking more of your attention than you expected? Maybe it was the media, maybe it's something else.
I think something that kept me up at night and still does and is a huge opportunity for the industry is measurement of marketing. The gold standard used to be marketing mix analysis, but as the landscape has fragmented, fewer pieces of what you're investing behind are measured through marketing mix, not to mention the lag time. You're not getting real-time data, and we operate in a real-time world. Marketers need that immediate feedback on their investments and what's working and what's not so that they can pivot and ensure they achieve their objectives.
Yeah. So with that said, measurement and I think bringing in agency and external partners are critical to businesses like yours. I want to talk a little bit about that. So before we get into though, I'm curious, this is related though, but there's a lot of discussion around the shift from good ideas to deployable ideas. So when you look back, have you seen great ideas die inside organizations, whether it's something internally that happened or maybe an external partner brought it? What are your thoughts there?
First of all, I believe very much in the power of big ideas and the power of creativity to drive business and brand outcomes. So, big believer in that. And yes, I've absolutely seen brilliant ideas die inside large organizations. Consensus by committee is absolutely a killer of creativity. Great creative ideas make people uncomfortable. And sometimes inside large organizations, that doesn't fly. So you have to be willing as a leader to take the risk, take the bold risk on an idea that may make people uncomfortable. That's usually when you have something that's going to be really good.
Yeah. Does any big risk come to mind in your career that everyone was kind of maybe saying no around you, but you pushed forward and it was a big win?
Most recent example would be on Stoke cold brew coffee. So again, we launched that to disrupt the ready to drink coffee category, but as a smaller emerging brand, it didn't have the biggest marketing budget, but we knew we needed to make a big splash and drive outsized awareness of what we were doing. And Stoke is all about boldness, bold cold brew, bold flavor, bold moves. And so in partnership with Maximum Effort, we came up with the idea for Stoke to sponsor Wrexham, the soccer team in Wales owned by Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. And it was a bold idea because why would we sponsor a soccer team in a country where we don't even sell the product? So you can imagine how that pitch went to leadership at the time. We're going to take all of our marketing investment for the year and sponsor a soccer team in Wales.
Wow.
And it was the most brilliant marketing move we ever did. Kudos to Carlos Ferraza, who was the president at the time, and said, this idea makes me very uncomfortable. Go do it. And we did. And it ended up being a huge success. It was a multi-year campaign where we sponsored the Stoke Kairos, the actual stadium where they played, but it turned into much more than that through the content and engagement that we delivered with Ryan Reynolds and the Wrexham fans.
Yeah, what a great story. Great campaign. Do you think agencies understand the internal constraints that you're dealing with, or are they mostly oftentimes just pitching into a vacuum?
It depends on the agency. I've seen it both ways. I think even the ones that understand the complexity and the politics underestimate it. And so I think if I had to give advice to agencies, it would be two things. One, spend a lot of time understanding who are the real decision makers, because usually it's not the VP that you're pitching to on the brand. There is someone else behind the scenes that's actually making the call. You need to know who that person is and have a relationship with them. And two, understand the business. Don't just understand the brand and the positioning and the values. Understand what marketing's really trying to achieve from a business standpoint, so you can speak to not just the marketing objectives, but the business objectives and the KPIs that your campaign will be measured against.
Yeah, that's really great. Great advice. So pick at that a little bit. When you're thinking about the best agency partners that you have worked with, what did they do differently than in how they engaged with the business beyond just the marketing brief? Like, how did they actually do what you just said?
The best agency partners are ones that become extensions of the brand team. They want to get to know your consumers. They dig into that, whether it's joining you through actual consumer research or conducting consumer research of their own outside the scope of work to truly uncover those insights that are going to make the campaign successful. And then they're not just beholden to a scope of work. They're so passionate about what they're learning and about what they're working on with your brand that they're willing to go above and beyond. They pitch you ideas you didn't brief because they're so excited about what they can do for your brand.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, I just came from the Possible conference in Miami last week, and there's a lot of angst among agencies right now with AI and just a lot of the disruption that's happening. When you think about building marketing organizations, how do you decide what capabilities you want to build internally versus where maybe outside partners or agencies can add real leverage?
I think it depends on the organization. At Danone, we did build out a lot of internal capabilities, but they never fully replaced agencies. So, for example, we did build out an internal creative team, and that was really helpful for some of those smaller brands that didn't necessarily have the budgets to hire an AOR on retainer. And so that was one example. They were also great in partnering with agencies on some of our brands. So you had people that lived and breathed your brand every day that were better able to partner and help bring ideas to life, so that they weren't just great big ideas, they were actually executable ideas. And then I think, there's things where if it's something that's going to constantly be changing, like marketing measurement, that's probably better to outsource to a vendor who's on the cutting edge of all the technology and the data that's going to feed into that.
Yeah. So would you say, are you on the camp of agencies should be specialists, or should they be at full service capabilities? What are your thoughts there?
Both. I want it all. I mean, I do think for bigger brands, it does make sense to engage bigger full service agencies. And then for smaller brands like Stoke, Maximum Effort was perfect for what our needs were. We also had a great relationship with Linkia, an influencer agency for brands where we're doing much more influencer and social led marketing. So I think there's room for both.
Yeah. And what about AI? Where do you think AI will replace agencies? Maybe where it won't?
I don't think AI will replace humans or agencies. I think it will dramatically change how we interact with them and how it impacts the creative process. So at Danone, we were leveraging AI at many points throughout the creative process, very much so to help with briefs and help with storyboards and mood boards, and then to test creative ideas. You can test things much more quickly through AI than you can through your traditional creative research processes. So it shortens your creative cycle and enables you to iterate a lot faster, which I think leads to better executions of great ideas. But at the end of the day, you still need that human touch, that human judgment. So much of what we do in marketing and with agencies is a combination of art and science. And AI cannot replicate the art component of it and the judgment, the creative judgment that goes into being a great marketer.
Yeah. Do you see AI enabling your internal teams in maybe some new ways where you're less reliant on agencies in certain areas?
Absolutely. I think AI can be huge in data analysis, huge in social listening. That's an increasingly important component of what you do as a marketer, understanding what people are saying about your brands in social media and what general trends are happening in your categories. And then I also think back to the creative process, it can help you build better briefs. I've seen so many agencies struggle because the brief they received from their client was not tight, was not strong. And brief writing is a really hard skill. I mean, I've led training classes on brief writing and, done boot camps and all of the above. It's still very hard to do. And I think partnering with the right AI tool to build a better brief will result in better outcomes.
Yeah, that's great. So we've talked a lot about your past. I'd like to talk a little bit about your future. I know you mentioned you just launched a podcast. Love to hear a little bit about that. And how are you thinking about the next chapter of your career?
So I'm a single mom of a 16-year-old girl, and we just launched a podcast together called A Brand New Perspective, which is perspectives on marketing and motherhood from a CMO and a Gen Z. And it's been a passion project of ours that started a few years ago when she had the opportunity to join me on a business trip to Colorado. We were sitting in the airport waiting for our flight when she said, "Why are we going to Colorado anyway?" And I said, "Oh, I'm speaking at a conference on marketing to Gen Z." And it was this light bulb moment of, well, wait a sec, you're Gen Z. Why am I speaking about this? Let's let the audience hear from the actual Gen Z. And so she joined me on stage, knocked it out of the park. Everybody swarmed her afterwards, wanted to hear more. And so it started this seed of an idea of why don't we actually speak together through a podcast and at conferences to share those different perspectives, because sometimes we agree, but more often than not, we have very different perspectives on things. So that's been taking up a lot of my time, and I'm enjoying every second before she goes off to college in 2 years.
That's great. How exciting. So, yeah, I have a 14-year-old daughter, and I love bouncing ideas off her. I don't know that she would be joining me on any stages, but maybe sometimes you just got to go and do it, right?
Absolutely. She had never done public speaking before. She was completely nervous, and now she loves it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Such a great experience that you guys could do that together. So outside of work, what else is something that kind of helps you reset or think more clearly when things get intense?
I am an avid reader. I read on average over 50 books a year. Part of several book clubs and group texts talking about books. So that is my way to unplug from everything and recharge.
Love that. Love that. So Linda, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you, sharing all these insights about your journey and the work that you've done and your future as well. I want to wrap things up here and just say, thank you again. And for everybody that is watching, don't forget to follow CMO Journeys for more conversations with the marketing leaders that are shaping what's next. I'm Christian Madak. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.